Hi everyone, and welcome to our webinar, Accelerate Climate Alignment with Temperature Scores from Theory to Practice. This webinar is hosted by WWF and CDP, building on our joint effort to update the CDP WWF temperature scoring methodology to version 1.5, released in September last year. For those of you who missed our launch webinar, we have provided a link to it by the end of this presentation. During this webinar, however, we will explore temperature scores and gain insights into CDP's net zero alignment dataset, as well as the WWF Implied Temperature Rise or ITR tool. But before we begin, just a quick reminder that this webinar is being recorded, and the presentation, along with the link to the recording, will be sent to you sometime during next week. We very much appreciate your questions, so please use the Q&A function to ask them, which you find in the meeting toolbar. The development team and the speakers of today. After that, we will give you a short recap of the CDP WWF temperature scoring methodology before moving on to CDP's net zero alignment dataset and a comparison of the temperature scores between the old version of the methodology released back in 2020 and the new version of the methodology version 1.5, which was released in September last year, as I previously mentioned. Then we will explore WWF ITR Tool along with its workflow, and after that give you an example where CDP data is used in the ITR tool. And finally, we finish up the webinar with a Q&A session. And now I'm pleased to introduce you to our development team. From CDP, we have Viktor Verhag and Helene Prokodinkovsky. And from WWF, we have Donald Linderyd, Peter Nyström, Julia Behm, and myself, Amanda Kihlman. Now a short recap of our temperature scoring methodology. Our methodology seeks to support both financial institutions but also corporates to assess and compare the ambition of company climate targets. In other words, it translates diverse greenhouse gas or GHG emission reduction targets into one comparable and intuitive metric, a temperature score, expressed as projected warming in degrees Celsius by the end of this century. To give you an example, say that company A sets a target to reduce its Scope 1 emissions by 30% in 5 years. This target implies an annual reduction rate which is consistent with an ambition heading towards X degrees Celsius, under the condition that all companies in the world behave the same. Using a temperature score as a metric is beneficial to understand value chain emissions, or Scope 3, and to set targets for your value chain or financial portfolio. It could also be used to inform engagement with different value chain partners and portfolio companies, as well as support decision-making around value chain and portfolio construction. Other key features of our methodology is that it is transparent, is an open source, and is data agnostic. The method also gives a detailed analysis as you receive 15 different temperature scores per company for each time frame and scope. The method includes 3 different steps displayed in this image, where step 1 is the benchmark creation. In this step, linear regression models for different variables and timeframes are created based on IPCC RS6 climate scenarios. Step 2 involve company-level scoring, where Step 2A, target validation, assesses the validity of targets based on certain criteria. And Step 2B, company scoring, selects targets and compute scope level and company level temperature scores. Lastly, step 3, portfolio scoring, aggregates multiple company scores into one portfolio score. This was a quite short recap of our method, and if you wish to have a more in-depth walkthrough, we please revise you to our methodology paper and to watch our launch webinar. Links are provided by the end of this presentation. A word on CDP's and WWF's development. Similar as back in 2020, when the first version of the method was released, the development of version 1.5 has been a joint effort by our two organizations, displayed as output 1. We have collaborated and supported each other throughout the implementation stage, resulting in two different solutions, displayed as output 2 in this picture. Worth mentioning is that the WWF ITR tool seen on the left here was previously developed by the SBTI, but with this method update, WWF has taken over the development. During the next part of this webinar, we will explore these two solutions. So I now hand it over to Victor, who will start with the CDP Net Zero Alignment dataset.
Thanks a lot, Amanda. And just a quick reminder for late joiners, please use the Q&A function to ask your questions. We will address them at the end of the presentation. Hi, everyone. A few words about me. I'm Victor Verhaag. I've been with CDP for 3 years, and I'm based in Berlin. I'm a senior product specialist in CDP's capital markets team. And when I'm not working with WWF on the temperature scoring methodology, my job involves developing and maintaining our net zero alignment dataset, or NZAD for short. NZAD is a commercial product from CDP, commercial data product. And I want to preface this section by emphasizing that what follows is meant less as a commercial pitch than as a way to highlight how my team has been interacting with the methodology on a daily basis for over 4 years now, and how that experience has shaped the evolution of our dataset over time. This also ties in well with the attribution analysis that we'll present later, which will provide important context for the discussion ahead. So NZAD was launched at the end of 2020, just a couple of months after the initial publication of the original temperature ratings methodology, as it was known at the time. The evolution from theoretical development to a practical implementation of that open source methodology was quite natural for us. Because as I'm sure you know, CDP collects thousands upon thousands of emissions reduction targets every year. And it is very challenging to understand how to sort and make sense of that multitude of targets at the company level. As a result, it felt like a perfect application opportunity to develop a solution for capital market users and beyond. Therefore, in the beginning, corporate ambition was at the heart of the product, and in a way, this is still true today. NZAD was originally designed to provide forward-looking assessments, calculating temperature scores based on the targets disclosed to CDP using the temperature scoring methodology. And it also features temperature scores derived from targets approved by the SBTI as a secondary target source. And targets are, of course, a critical component of any transition strategy. They provide valuable insights into a company's stated direction of travel. However, after a few years, we began to wonder about whether companies were actually taking action or just setting ambitious goals without following through. And with this in mind, we worked on expanding our approach. We wanted to give users a more complete picture, something that goes beyond just what companies say they'll do. And by leveraging CDP's extensive response data, we developed new metrics designed to hold companies accountable with the goal of helping users understand whether companies are truly serious about their transition and if they're likely to reach their targets. And before I go over these additional scores, I think it's worth mentioning that these metrics are based on methodologies developed in-house by CDP. And for now, they remain separate from our collaboration with WWF. One of the first additional metrics we introduced focuses on evaluating what companies are currently doing to support their level of ambitions reflected in their targets. Specifically, it assesses a company's transition plan disclosure through its responses to the CDP questionnaire, determining whether they cover the key elements of a credible climate transition plan. This results in a credibility score, which helps users contextualize a company's ambition by assessing the thoroughness of the roadmap the company has reported to achieve its targets. For example, if a company has a 1.5 degree temperature score, but only a 25% credibility score, it suggests that the company is unlikely to achieve such a high level of ambition. And while this credibility assessment is rooted in the present, we also introduced two backward-looking assessments to factor in companies' emissions performance. In other words, how do their recent achievements compare to their stated commitments? The first backward-looking metric is a trend assessment, which evaluates a company's emissions reduction trajectory over a minimum of 3 years and up to 6 years. And by calculating a normalized annual reduction rate and projecting it into the short term, we derive an additional temperature score that provides context for a company's near-term ambition. The second backward-looking metric is a target performance score, and it takes a slightly different approach. Instead of focusing on trends, we measure a company's actual emissions performance against the assumptions assumptions underlying its targets. So regardless of ambition, this metric determines whether a company is currently on track to meet its scored target, whether it is lagging behind or exceeding expectations. Essentially, it compares the progress required by the target at a given point in time with the company's actual progress. And these four metrics are calculated independently. They do not influence one another, nor are they aggregated into a single score. Instead, they are designed to be looked at side by side to provide a clearer picture of where a company stands in its transition journey. Where does it say it's going? Does it have a credible plan to get there? And how is it actually performing so far? And with these different metrics, NZAD users can use the data in a variety of ways. They can leverage it for reporting purposes. They can identify leaders and laggards in their portfolio. They can use it to screen and engage with companies and ultimately assess the current temperature of their portfolio or their supply chain. It also enables them to set targets to increase the ambition of their investments or suppliers and track progress across all of these indicators. NZAD's metrics are designed to be flexible and can be applied across different target setting frameworks, including the SBTi's near-term criteria for financial institutions and the IIGCC's net zero investment framework. Additionally, the dataset includes a dedicated section focused on high-impact companies where we assess their alignment, both current and future, with physical intensity trajectories under the sectoral decarbonization approach. And finally, a quick note on NZAD's coverage. The dataset is updated several times a year and provides non-default temperature scores for approximately 10,000 companies, and even more if you factor in credibility scores. This slide displays coverage for each metric across MSCI's main indices, with percentages based on the number of companies within each index, rather than index weights. As you can see, coverage is particularly strong in Europe, Japan, and the US, with slightly lower levels for global and emerging markets. We intend to release a new version of the dataset at the end of February, reflecting both the new methodology and CDP's 2024 response data, which was just published a couple of weeks ago. So stay tuned for that. And finally, if you'd like to learn more about NZAD, I encourage you to visit the product page on CDP's website and request a demo. We'd be happy to take you through a deeper dive into this data solution. All right, moving on now. We'd like to present to you the results of the attribution analysis that we conducted to assess the impact of the new methodology on temperature scores. And this is a question that we've been asked quite frequently since the new version was announced. Well, we had already tested the methodology on theoretical data during the development phase. We had yet to conduct a full-scale analysis on a large sample of real-world targets to understand how scores were actually affected. So to evaluate the impact of the new version, we focused on the changes that had the most practical influence on scoring outcomes, and these are outlined here on this slide. The most significant change and the core focus of the methodology update was, of course, to ensure that the methodology remained aligned with the latest climate science. And this involved updating the climate model inputs with the most recent IPCC AR6 climate simulations. We also refined our approach to calculating emissions reduction rates, shifting from a linear to a compound reduction approach. And another key update was the introduction of separate benchmarks for Scope 1 and Scope 2 targets, which were previously assessed together. Additionally, we improved and clarified the target selection process, what we refer to as the waterfall, to ensure a more structured and transparent approach. And finally, two adjustments were made to the scoring framework. The default score for companies without valid targets was increased from 3.2 to 3.4 degrees Celsius, and a temperature floor of 1.5 degrees was also introduced, which means that the best score that a company can get under the new method is 1.5. So to quantify how each of these changes impacted company scores, we followed a structured approach. We used a sample of roughly 1,600 companies from the iShares ACWI ETF to ensure broad sectoral and geographic coverage. We sourced temperature scores for these companies from CDP's net zero alignment dataset using both the old and new methodology implementations for comparison. And the analysis was based exclusively on midterm targets disclosed to CDP in 2023. That means that we excluded targets approved by TSBTI, although they're available in NZAD, and we also excluded other potential target sources. And of course, each methodology version was applied to the same set of targets to ensure consistency and comparability. And one final note on the approach, the first version of the methodology did not include a temperature floor, which led to different implementation choices across different temperature scoring providers. For example, CDP's net zero alignment dataset opted for a 1.5 temperature floor from the start, whereas most other implementations out there went for a 0-degree floor. Therefore, for this analysis, we assumed a 0-degree floor for the results under version 1. And before diving into the details of the analysis, we wanted to highlight our main conclusions upfront. And the key message that we wanted to share with you today is that overall temperature scores tend to increase moderately under the new methodology. So what's driving that? One aspect that surprised us somewhat was the minor impact of the revised target selection process or waterfall, because after having implemented version 1 for years, CDP and WWF had come to the conclusion that the waterfall was neither fully exhaustive nor mutually exclusive. And as a result, multiple targets could remain after filtering, and different interpretations could lead to different target selections. So to resolve this, we revamped the waterfall by introducing additional selection criteria and restructuring the hierarchy to eliminate any ambiguity. And however, these changes, the impact of these changes turned out to be relatively small, as the same targets tend to be selected. On the other hand, there were less surprises with the introduction of the 1.5 temperature floor and the higher default score from 3.2 to 3.4, as they both had the expected effect of driving scores upward, particularly at the distribution's extremes. And if we neutralize these two factors, what remains is a moderate upward shift in scores, primarily driven by the new AR6-based benchmarks and the transition to a compound annual reduction approach. And this takeaway, both in terms of the direction and magnitude of the impact, is consistent with the preliminary testing we conducted during the development phase. So it's great to see those initial findings validated with large-scale real-world data. And with that, I'll now hand it over to Hélène, who will take you through the detailed analysis.
Thank you, Victor, and hi, everyone. So I'm Hélène, I work with Victor at CDP. I'm not going to take too much time because we are aware that there are quite technical details, and the key insights from the analysis are those that Victor just presented. But the intention here is rather to explain that we've done quite a bit of research and analysis to ensure that our changes in the methodology are not making it impractical to users of the methodology. And that those that are actually interested in the technical details can reach out to us or refer back to the presentation to understand the drivers of score changes between the old version and the new version, especially when they engage with companies. Okay, so as Victor already highlighted, one of the key insights from the analysis is that overall, when we analyze the same data set of scores but apply the old and new version of the methodology and then compare, the outcome is not fundamentally different on average. So indeed, what you can see on this slide is the analysis for midterm scope 1 and 2 targets. And on the left-hand side, you can see a box plot with the old version and new version of the methodology in terms of distribution of scores. And essentially, the distribution shifted a little bit up. And this is what we intended, this coherence, to ensure continuity and usability. We really looked for improvement in the methodology, not fundamental changes. And when we think about quantifying the magnitude of those changes of scores induced by the new version for the same target data for individual companies, we're really seeing that those changes are centered around fairly small differences, and that's the chart on the right-hand side. So that's the first point that we wanted to make here. The second point is that, of course, there are some companies for which the score did change a lot from the old version to the new version, and why. One of the first reasons, as was highlighted before, is that we introduced a floor. So you can see on this slide is essentially buckets of distribution of scores, and on the right-hand side, the new methodology, and you have this accumulation around the 1.5 and also around the default score, which is now 3.4. So this change from 3.2 to 3.4. And so, of course, that's something that might have induced changes, because in the old version, for some reason, you could have a company that had a score much lower than 1.5. And finally, this next slide gives you a bit of a bigger picture idea of what this analysis of score changes tells us. There's a lot of information, but I'm going to walk you through some key insights here. For example, you can see, if you follow the lower part of this tree, is that essentially between the old version and the new version of the methodology, you basically have the same amount of companies approximately that have default scores. And as we said before, for the purpose of this analysis, we only use data disclosed to CDP. We didn't consider other public targets or SBTi approved targets. But because we do have this data for SBTi approved target, we did check, if it was a large part of our sample of the iShares ACWI ETF. And in fact, we found that the companies that has an SBTi approved target amongst those companies that we see having default score is only 12%. So it's 12% of the 50%. So it's actually not something that influences our analysis much. And the other things to highlight is now looking at targets for which we have non-default temperature scores. So the upper part of the chart, the calculated targets in green. What you can see is actually that a lot of companies do have different scores, so around 82%. And as we just mentioned, those changes are overall minimal in magnitude. But something new that I want to show in this slide is that when you look at the right-hand side of the slide, that actually out of those companies who had different scores, 91% actually had the same target selected by the new waterfall. So as Victor mentioned, we did change the waterfall, the waterfall of target selection, and we can see essentially here that this is not what has been driving this change of scores. So what does that tell us? Indeed, when we think about what has been driving these score differences, it's indeed the change of scenario set between the SR15 and the AR6. And actually that also makes sense given the fact that a few years passed since those two scenario sets, global emissions increased. So you can think about it as the same target, the same ambition now results in a, let's say, higher temperature outcome. Finally, to conclude, I won't take much time on that because the results for the Scope 3 analysis are more or less the same, except that we do have more companies for which we're seeing an increase in temperature scores for their Scope 3 targets compared to the previous method. We have a bit more of a skewed up of distribution in terms of score differences. But if we go to this last slide again, what I would like to highlight is that here, if we look at exactly the same part of the tree, so the calculated targets on the upper part and the companies that have a different score compared to the old methodology, we actually see that this time it's partly due to the new waterfall methodology. We have this 98% that is, partial target match, which means that we've selected more or less a different target. And essentially, this is because the new methodology is much more granular in the way that we handle and aggregate Scope 3 targets covering different Scope 3 categories, especially in the absence of a headline Scope 3 target. So this new Scope 3 approach does have an impact on the Scope 3 temperature scores in our sample when we think about the changes from the old to the new methodology. So different diagnostic, essentially. And of course, this is to put things a bit into context. I think an insight to highlight as well is that when we think about Scope 3 targets, there is 72% of companies in this universe that have a default score. So with this, I will hand over to Peter to present their tool. Thank you.
Thanks.
Well, thank you, Hélène, and hello, everyone. I'm Peter Nystrom, and I am the lead developer of the ITR, the WWF ITR tool. I've been with the WWF for about 4 years now, and I previously maintained the predecessor to this tool, the SBTI finance tool. So let's jump right in. So this tool is a software package that financial institutions and companies can use to assess the alignment of current climate targets and commitments for investment and lending portfolios. And then in turn, the output can be used for setting climate targets for portfolios, as well as when you look at value chains for companies, since we've increased the Scope 3 coverage in the tool, as well as the methodology, of course. You can also use the output for official validation by the SBTI. So if you're, for example, a portfolio manager or analyst and you're looking at company sectors or investment strategies, you could use the tool to understand how the analyzed companies contribute to the climate impact of the portfolio. And some use areas there would be, of course, to measure the whole portfolio's temperature score, and in that to identify the biggest contributors to the temperature score of a portfolio, right, from on a company or a country or a sector basis. You can then use it for strategic allocation and security selection, and to analyze the effects of the aggregated temperature scores from changes in the portfolio. You can model impact of engagement with certain companies on the aggregated temperature score, and thus you can plan strategies for interacting with companies in the portfolio. And so you can also look at sort of detailed targets per company, for instance, by looking at multiple Scope 3 categories. So that can help also to with the analysis and improve the engagement action. The input from the tool can come from many data sources, and we should note that the tool does not provide any fundamental or target data. That's sort of up to the user to collect. So we're data agnostic, and it can come from data can come from many sources. Of course, we do have some prescribed formats that are very clearly described in the tool documentation. But we do, however, read information from the SBTI on companies with validated targets in order to be able to calculate portfolio coverage. So the tool implements then the CDP WWF method in this open source methodology, open source Python code package, and we convert the targets to temperature scores, and you can aggregate to portfolio level or the sector and look at market, sectors and geographies and so on with the various notebooks that are included in the package. And so that means you can measure the alignment with the Paris Agreement. You can set portfolio emissions reduction targets. You can calculate portfolio coverage, and you can target companies for action. So you can sort of use a tool to engage or to divest or to shift your portfolio in any way you see fit or necessary. And then the output, of course, can be used in multiple ways. And also, you can integrate the tool and the output in your local infrastructure, existing infrastructure, as you wish, or just run it as a standalone tool. The main components of the tool are this open source Python package, which is available on GitHub and the Python packet index. And we also have a number of Jupyter notebooks that are provided with the package and are available through the GitHub repo. And so the notebooks, they have different levels of detail, and they go from the first one, which is fairly detailed and actually steps through a lot of the methodology in an abbreviated fashion, so that you can sort of perhaps get a better understanding of the methodology. And there's some demo data provided that you can sort of play around with to get acquainted with it. We have the second one, which is a very quick portfolio temperature score calculation, and we have one that is for what-if analysis, where you can test different engagement strategies in the portfolio and so on. We also have some that just aggregate scores, for instance, from data providers such as CDP, where you can sort of take the finished temperature scores from a bunch of companies and aggregate those according to some aggregation principle. And finally, you can also use, there's a notebook that can be used for reporting to the SBTI, which anonymizes a lot of the input so that you can sort of send files to SBTI. Right, and these notebooks can be run in Google Colab. That's a very straightforward way of doing it if you start from the repo. But if you're actually running with your proprietary data, it's perhaps a better idea to run it locally if you want to avoid uploading data to Google. When we compare with version 1.0, some of the most important changes are, of course, that the maintenance is now in the hands of WWF Sweden. And I could highlight some other things, such as the target validation and target selection is much more detailed now in the method paper. So we've been able to implement this without having to interpret or do any of our own conclusions. It's fairly one-to-one with reflecting the method paper. And when it comes to scope 3, we now allow input of separate scope 3 targets and GHG data for all scope 3 categories. So you can have more input there and more analysis. And we can use temperature targets as valid targets in the data as well. Whereas before it was emission reduction targets that we used. It's now possible, for instance, to have a financial institution in the portfolio, and FIs that have set, for instance, a climate target using this very methodology, then can be included in the input data. So that's an important addition, meaning that an investment portfolio can have a bunch of financial institutions with approved targets using this method in the portfolio. And of course, we're using the new regression models, and we also try to separate and calculate the temperature scores on the most disaggregated level, so that we can calculate separately for scope 1 and scope 2, and then reaggregate later on in the calculations. And we've also included the temperature floor as per the new version of the method, and raised the default temperature score to 3.4 from previously 3.2. So the key features, to summarize, are that this is an open source code base. We use an MIT license, meaning that you're free to copy and make your own versions of this, as long as you cite the original copyright holders. And it can reside in any infrastructure as you please, since the code is yours to use. We're data agnostic, like we said. It's up to the user to provide the data. And that means that there's, the tool as such doesn't compromise data security, and it's fully transparent. All the source code is available for you to look at, and it's been tried with very large portfolios, so it should be scalable in that sense. And so we see it as a workflow tool that you can integrate and work as a CIO or investment analyst looking at the ESG issues, for instance. And to demonstrate that very topic, using this in a workflow, I'll hand over to my colleague Donald to actually demonstrate this. So over to you, Donald.
Thank you so much, Peter. So I'm Donald Lindryd. I work with WWF in Sweden, same place as Peter and Amanda, and I've been with them for about 5 years. And I was also very much involved in the original development of the methodology, and even more so when it came to the development and the design of this tool, this ITR tool that was under the SPTI development previously, which we have now taken over into WWF. So I'll take you through a very short sort of demonstration of what a typical workflow could look like and what you can actually do with this solution. I should mention we got a question after the last webinar this morning on improvements and things like that. We should mention that WWF is not a software developer. There are others out there that are much better than us at developing software. So what we are providing here is a template for others to develop their solutions around. And with that said, so what you have here is essentially examples of what you could do. But for this to fit into your particular workflow, that could be some hands-on work for you to work on there. And having said that, with what Peter said also, that this is an open source MIT license, you can build sort of commercial products out of this, such as Bloomberg and ICE and others have done. And they obviously build their own implementation of this, adding on their own features. But so this demonstrates a little bit of what you can do with the version that we have released with the templates that are out there. So first things first, you find the solution on our GitHub, and I posted the link in the Q&A tab earlier, but we'll send you those links later on as well. And what you want to go to is to our documentation around the tool, and there you want to find the Google Colab section and click on the analysis example, which I'm going to take you through parts of today. This is designed for those who don't know any coding at all, or actually don't know very much about this methodology either. It is designed to take you through the methodology step by step and do the calculations as we explain them. And it's also designed to show you how to actually run this tool and ingest your own data should you wish to do so. The data comes with the tool, this particular notebook comes with some dummy data. So the numbers that you see on the screen here has nothing to do with reality. In this section of the demonstration, it's completely made up numbers, so don't pay any attention to those. This is just to demonstrate how it actually works. And for you to be able to run it without doing anything, you can just essentially go in and say run, and it will work for you. So in order to find also the sections here, you should open up the table of contents that show you the different sections of this notebook. Those who are familiar with Jupyter notebooks or Google Colab notebooks probably think that this is a little bit in excess of requirements, but yeah, that's why we're trying to make it as easy as possible to follow. So the other thing that you need is some input data. As I said, this solution comes with some dummy data, so you can run it. But if you want to do your own analysis, you obviously need your own portfolio data, which is essentially some company ID and the investment value of those in your portfolio. And you need some fundamental data, so that has to do with sort of the identity of the company, some GHG emissions data. Depending on which aggregation method you choose for your portfolio aggregation, it could require revenue or total assets or market cap or enterprise value and cash and things like that. The other parts is obviously target data, where we need the individual targets, and this is important to state that they should be on a line-by-line basis. So you should have one target for one line for each target, so one company can take up many different lines. And what the tool and the methodology, and especially the filtering mechanisms within the waterfall takes care of, is that you can ingest pretty much as many data sets you want into this, and it will select the appropriate data set from that. So if you have data sets from CDP and MSCI and Bloomberg, whoever, you can ingest all of those into this should you wish to. So when you've done that and you press run, you will be presented with a matrix of the temperature scores for the portfolio as a first step in your analysis. And so this is quite different from many other solutions in the marketplace, that we provide short, medium, and long-term temperature scores for all single scopes 1, 2, and 3, and for the combined scopes 1 and 2 and 1, 2, and 3, as well, as you can see here. So it gives you quite a detailed analysis of the portfolio straight away, so you know where you may have issues and where you need to focus your attention. You can also do this on a sectorial basis, and for example, see here that healthcare and materials provide a much bigger contribution to the high temperature in this particular portfolio than compared to their weight in the portfolio. So another way to look at the portfolio is on a heat map analysis, and what you see here in gray is it's simply just sectors and regions where we don't have any exposure in this particular demo set of data, and the darker you get, the hotter the companies are, so to speak. And what we can do with this is to drill in and say, okay, why is European industrials so high? You may think that it shouldn't be. So we can quickly just run a, and this is all pre-programmed. So if you run through this in this notebook, you will see this. But you may want to look at other regions and other sectors, so you can just swap those in this analysis, and you would get the results from those instead. And here we see obviously that this is essentially a general problem across the board for the industrial sector. You have a lot of default scores there, and others, the other two, have quite high scores as well. So that gives some insight into what that is, and you can obviously investigate those companies further. So when you're thinking about sort of who should you actually engage with, then when you've done this analysis, the knee-jerk reaction may be that you should be looking at the companies with a big a percentage in your portfolio or with a large contribution to your overall temperature score. But given that this particular company here, you don't own very much of it, 0.2% of the company, what are your chances that you will actually be successful in your engagement? Wouldn't it be better to look at a company like the third one down on the list here, where you own about 5% of the company? It still weighs okay in your portfolio, so it's quite an important holding for you. So let's have a look at that. So we note the company ID here because we need to know that at a later stage. So here we do a scenario, sort of a what-if scenario. What if we are successful in engaging with this company Q and ask them to set at least a well below 2 degree target? And so we ingest this company into our engagement target list, which is, if you go into the portfolio file, you see that you can sort of pre-populate that sort of target list if you want right at the outset, or you can add them here, which is what we're doing in this little piece of code. And what you get out of that is that you can see that the overall midterm scope 1 and 2 temperature scores went from 282 to 266 for the overall portfolio, and we see some improvement on a sectorial basis. I should point out that we've had some questions in the Q&A chat here that these target that we cover scope 3 naturally as well. We're just demonstrating this with scope 1 and 2. So if you look at the what happened to then company Q in this case, as you can see, is moved down much further down the list. It's not contributing nearly as much to the overall portfolio temperature score, because they've obviously improved that temperature score quite a bit. And as the final output for company Q, we can get all of those 15 temperature scores for company Q, so that we can really see where we need to have further conversations with them around this. And obviously we have a scope 3 issue with this particular company. You also can do a data dump. That's the very last piece of this slide here, so that you can analyze this in any other application should you wish to. I should just go through a couple of slides here because we've used the CDP dataset to ingest that into the ITR tool to see what the iShares ACWI actually looks like when you do this type of analysis. And this is just a picture on the scope 1 and 2 for the iShares ACWI, and we can see that we have some problem areas in Asian consumer discretionary and in European IT, which I find quite interesting. If we swap to scope 3 of this, we see that we have a much darker red picture, obviously with higher temperatures there, and no surprise that we have a big chunk of that in the energy sector, pretty much across the board. So with that, I think we have a few minutes left for Q&A to answer some of your questions. We have been answering some of them in the chat, in the Q&A chat, but I think I'll hand over to Amanda for that.
Yeah, thank you, Donald. Yeah, we have some questions in the chat, that's correct. And we have answered some of them already, but I think it could be important to address them here in the more open space too, some of them at least. And First of all, I see that some of the questions in the Q&A relates to our temperature score and how it is computed. And I will first just start to highlight that our temperature scoring methodology only assesses companies' targets or the ambition of the target, not how they're currently or the company currently live up to those targets. There are other solutions that investigate that, but not our methodology. And it covers all scopes, and scores are calculated at individual scope level and can even be calculated at the category level when it comes to scope 3 before being aggregated at scope 1 and scope 2 and scope 1, 2, and 3 levels, just to clarify that first. But we have a question regarding the temperature floor, and I think, Helen, you can answer that question. It is related to its temperature floor of 1.5 already obsolete given the recent temperature measurements for January 25th.
Yeah, so I assume it's talking about some estimates of the fact we already breached that warming. If it's that the case, I think it's worth clarifying that the dependent variable we're using in our regression models and from the AR6 scenario database is the temperature at the end of the century. So even if they are very in all likelihood going to be overshoots, this is basically what we're targeting here. And the way we build the floor is essentially seeing out of those 1,200 vetted scenarios, what is the lowest temperature you could get to at this point, set by hundreds of teams of scientists that are building those scenarios at the end of the century. And right now, this lower floor is more or less 1.5. If it turns out that in the future this changes, which unfortunately might be the case, then yes, there would be a potential case for updating the floor.
Perfect. Thank you for clarifying that. I think that both Donald and Peter mentioned that, but we got a question related to this, like how is this going to be an open, like is the methodology an open source, and is the code an open source, or is it a licensing fee related to it? And so that's the first question to WWF, I think.
I can start it. Yeah, go on,
yeah.
Peter. Shoot.
No, about the license, yeah, like I think I mentioned briefly that it is under a so-called MIT license, which is very common for open source projects, and that means I put a link in the Q&A as well, and that means specifically that users are free to copy and modify and do things with the code that they see fit, as long as they give sort of the credit to the original copyright holders in their own license file. So as long as you say where the code comes from, you're free to use it. Yeah.
We can add that you can build commercial solutions around this, which is what we have a number of those from ICE and Bloomberg and others.
Super. And there's also a question related to NZAD and CDP, if these are available to signatories. Maybe it's a question for you, Victor.
Yeah, thanks, Amanda. Yeah, indeed, NZAD is a commercial data product from CDP, so it is accessible for a fee. And as a signatory, I would encourage you to reach out to your account manager to get more information about how you could get access to that data set as part of your membership. And yeah, that's it.
Super. And do we plan to revise our methodology, and when? Maybe Victor, you can elaborate on that too.
Yeah, sure. So yeah, that version update was published in September. Since then, we've been very focused on implementing our respective implementations of the methodology and actually making sure that each implementation was aligned with each other. So we performed a lot of testing to make sure that if you were to use the exact same sample of target data, you would get the exact same results on all scopes. And so we've done that. So that's good. And now we're going to move on to the next phase of the methodology update, where we want to develop something that is a bit more sector specific, which is something that is not really covered by the methodology right now. I mean, to some extent, there's some cross-sectoral benchmarks that we have, but ideally, we would like to have something a bit more sector specific. And in the same vein, we would also have, would like to do some research about developing some sector specific default scores. So that it's a bit of a fair approach when it comes to assigning default scores to companies without valid targets. Yeah, that's the key focus of our research going forward. But nothing scheduled for the coming months. Probably a publication at the end of the year at the best, and probably early 2026.
Thank you. And maybe, Helen, this is a question for you. Is the model able to change to a different endpoint? And would the temperature scores adjust accordingly, for example, 2050 instead of the end of the century?
Yeah, so I mean, there are this particular variable, the temperature in 2050, I think, is available in the AR6 scenarios. So it's definitely possible. It would create different, I guess, regression output, and so different benchmarks to assess the targets of the companies against. But my initial thought is, why? I mean, we're basically trying to implement the concept of the Paris Agreement, right? And the Paris Agreement has ambitions related to what we can achieve. Well, actually, there are diverging interpretations. Some say by the end of the century, and some say throughout the century. So I guess for me, the question is more, how much do we want to allow for overshoots throughout that period? And that is something that I think we should think more about in the context of the methodology and the next phase of research.
Yeah, super. Thank you. Let's see here. I have a few more questions, maybe one more we can address. The WWF tool only assesses the impact of targets, not how the company is actually performing versus these targets. Did I get that right? Maybe, Donald, you want to elaborate a little bit more on that?
The short answer is yes. And that is what we're currently doing with this tool. We have some potential plans. We'll see whether we can stretch this a little bit further, but I can't promise anything on that. But it is essentially a tool to set your targets and to monitor those targets based on the ambition of the companies, the underlying constituents of your value chain or your portfolio, and whether they are actually achieving those or not is a different question altogether.
Could you please share some more info about how the credibility score is calculated within the CDP net zero dataset?
Sure, yeah. Thanks, Amanda. Yeah, so that metric, it's essentially leveraging responses to the CDP questionnaire, covering specific aspects, which are the key elements of a credible climate transition plan. And there's about 20 different indicators reflected in as many questions in the CDP questionnaire, covering different themes from corporate governance to emissions accounting, financial planning, stuff like that. And the idea behind the credibility score methodology, which is quite basic, but it works pretty well for the time being, is that we look at whether companies have reported anything on each of those questions, and we look at the most advanced version of each of those sub questions to see whether companies have something in place or not, covering these specific aspects of a transition plan. So it's more of a checklist rather than looking at the actual responses from companies. But for the time being, it's quite insightful because companies perform quite poorly on these assessments. I think 90% of companies have a score below 50%, which is not great. So there's still a lot to do on that front. And so although it is quite rudimentary for the time being, this methodology is already quite insightful, and we have some ideas on how to make it evolve as well. So maybe Ellen, you can share a few things on that front.
Yeah, I mean, as you said, I think there's a lot to do with this data. So right now we're posing minimum requirements in terms of what we think a company should, do, and the bar is not really high, but there's a lot of things that and a lot of great frameworks out there. Actually, I'm thinking, for example, about ACT. For those who are not familiar, it's called Assessing the Carbon Transition, Assessing Transition Planning, Transition Indicators. There's a lot to do with CapEx data, for example, and how that can be used as a predictor of corporate emissions reduction. So I think taking it a step further and kind of thinking about assessing those data points, those that we can assess quantitatively, I think is an exciting research field.
Well, thank you for sharing those insights. It's very interesting. I also was wondering, when do you plan to revise the methodology? I mean, this is the version 1.5. How does the future outlook look like? And I think this is a question to WWF, but also to CDP.
I can start maybe.
Yeah.
So the idea is that since September, when we published the new version of the methodology, we've been very much focused on our respective implementations of the method. So for CDP, it meant translating the new method into an algorithm that we use to ingest CDP targets. And for WWF, obviously, it involved creating that ITR tool and updating it with the new methodology. And we actually spent some time making sure that our respective implementations were perfectly aligned with each other. So we spent some time using a large sample of target data and making sure that the same target source was producing the same results. And we did that on all scopes and all timeframes. And it took a while to get there because the methodology is very granular. But yeah, if you were to use the same targets and fit them into our dataset or into WWF's solution, you would get the same results. And yeah, now that that is done, we will focus on what we call version 2 of the methodology. We don't intend to change the benchmarks because we are using the latest bunch of scenarios from the IPCC. But what we want to focus on going forward is to hopefully manage to develop something that is a bit more sector specific, while still using a warming function approach, which is the life and soul of the method. So that's what we want to focus on, and also try to develop sector specific default scores instead of having a unique default score for all companies, notwithstanding their sector of activity. We'd also like to try to account for the usage of carbon credits. So that's something that we need to look into as a future development possibility. Yeah, that's the key focus, I think.
I was also wondering, maybe a question to Donald or Peter in this case. Could you elaborate a little bit more about the benefits of using the WWF ITR tool, and who are the main users within a company or financial institution?
I can talk to sort of, yeah, so the main users, I would say, in terms of organizations first would be we have a number of pension funds and larger asset managers and asset owners that do this, but also actually from all sizes, I should say, and quite a lot of them integrate them into their sometimes homegrown portfolio management solutions or other portfolio management solutions that they use. And that's one of the key features of the tool, that you can since it's a Python code, it's quite easy to integrate into other IT systems that you have. In terms of usage, what kind of people who actually use them in the financial services sector, where it has been mostly used now, I think it's largely down to ESG analysts, but also portfolio managers that use this, sometimes CIOs and so on, that use it on a daily basis. The implementation is generally left to the IT department to sort out. And the benefits, I should say, is that it is open source, that it is data agnostic, and that it shows the detailed nature of the temperature scores that you can get from the methodology, rather than having one temperature scores, which we have from some other providers out there. This gives you a very detailed map of where to start work with a particular company. And we hear that from users, that they really appreciate that, so that it doesn't become a compliance solution, but actually a tool they can actually work in that daily workflow in order to improve their portfolio, to support their investment cases and lending cases and so on. And that's exactly why we built it and how we built it. When we first sort of designed it back in 2020, I was in charge of designing the first tool, and I was also involved in developing the original methodology, to make sure that you can use it as a daily workflow solution and a decision support solution, rather than a compliance tool for some reporting. But that goes for not only the tool naturally, but also for the methodology and the way that CDP's data set that they've built as well has the same granularity here. So I think it's quite general for both our solutions.
Thank you for sharing those insights. We just have 1 minute left of this webinar, so I think I'm just going to wrap it up. And thank you all so much for participating. And also, please feel free to reach out to us if you have additional questions. You find the contact details on this slide in the bottom, and you will also send this presentation to you afterwards. Well, thank you so much. Have a nice day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone.